Hey, class, in this first podcast, I want to talk about the growing separation between the societies and the ideologies of the slaveholding states of the United States and the free states, the states of the U.S. that had no slavery. In many respects, the Civil War is a puzzle. If you think about it, most of the whites white males, uh, who ran the U.S., most were Protestant, the vast majority. You have a growing population of Catholics. Um, all Americans had a shared history, especially of the American Revolution. So, shared religion, shared history, shared language. Virtually everyone spoke English. As immigration started to occur and speed up in the 1840s and 1850s, that changed somewhat as folks from Germany came. But of course, the Irish, they came into the North in the 1840s and 50s. They spoke English as well. So there's a common language. The other aspect of this is that the economies of the North and South were deeply, deeply integrated. Um, the South produced cotton. Now, the South produced other commodities as well, sugar in Louisiana and East Texas, tobacco, but cotton was the big story. Cotton production, this is where the wealth of the South was. This is what the vast majority of the enslaved captives were working, the fields that they were working, cotton fields. So when you look at the economy of the South, it's a commodity economy, and cotton was front and center of that story. And a good bit of that cotton went to Europe, especially England, a little bit less to France, but also a significant portion, maybe about a quarter or so of the cotton went to northern textile mills in New England, like Lowell, Massachusetts, and other mills. There were a number of mills in Providence, Rhode Island. And so the North grew quite wealthy on cotton. It wasn't just the South. So the economies are very tightly integrated. New York City was very significant to Southerners, in that a lot of the cotton that was shipped from the South was shipped from ships from New York City. Major northern urban areas played a big role in the Southern economy, and the Southern economy enriched these northern urban areas as well. So you've got all these interconnections and these commonalities. So why the Civil War? Well, just really briefly, I could teach a whole course on the antebellum period. It's really actually a very fascinating period. But what we have here is, and the reason that most scholars, and it's pretty convincing, there's a strong consensus about this. You have the free labor ideology of the North intersects with the desire of Northerners to keep new territory acquired by the United States out of the hands of slaveholders. And I'm going to develop this idea in this podcast and maybe another short podcast, and then move on to the sectional crisis. So, very briefly, what you had in the United States between 1800 or so and 1860 was tremendous growth. By the time of the Civil War, the US population was 31 million, about 400,000. I'm not going to test you on that, by the way, just get a sense. Uh, in 1860, the South had about 8 million whites. There were 20 million whites in the North. So demographically, the North far outnumbered the South by 1860. And one of the reasons for this is most immigrants that came into the United States, especially immigrants from Ireland, that was the great source of immigration in the 1840s and 1850s because of the potato famine in Ireland. Most immigrants went to northern states because they couldn't compete with slave labor. immigrants were very reluctant to come into southern states because they didn't want to compete with slave labor, because you can't compete against a worker that doesn't get paid. Also, there was no industry to speak of in the South as well. And many of the immigrants that came into the North came into the North working or hoping to work in some of the industries that were developing in the North, especially the textile industries of the North. So basically, big picture, the North far outnumbers the South in terms of population. So you've got 20 million whites in the North. 20 million in the North was basically 98% white in 1860, overwhelmingly white. In the South, you have 8 million whites, and you had 4 million slaves, just under 4 million slaves. Slavery had grown from 1.2 million in 1800 to almost 4 million in 1860. So you've got a growth in slavery, and hand in hand with that growth in slavery, you have a growth in cotton production. In 1820, there were 160 million pounds of cotton cultivated almost exclusively by slave labor, about 1 billion pounds of cotton in 1850. And by 1860, just before the Civil War, about 2.3 billion pounds of cotton cultivated. So we go from 160 million pounds of cotton in 1820 to 2.3 billion pounds of cotton cultivated by 1860. And again, don't get stressed out by these figures. I'm not the kind of professor that goes that deeply in the weeds, although, you can remember it, great. What I'm trying to get across here is growth, and the growth in cotton production. Mostly going to Europe, but also a significant amount of cotton going to the states of the U.S. Northeast. So the slave labor of the labor of the enslaved in the South both enriched Southerners, but it also enriched Northerners as well. What you had in the North that was different from the South, you had the growth of industries in the North beginning in the 1820s all the way up into 1860. For instance, by 1840, there were 1,200 cotton good factories in the United States and almost none in the South. The South had no desire to have factories whatsoever, and this is one of the things we're going to talk about. You've also have woolen mills in the North. 1850, there were 1,500 woolen mills in the North. You have firearm production in the North. You have furniture being produced in the North. Boots are being produced in the North. Manufactured shoes are being manufactured in the North. So you have an industry infrastructure that's being developed in the North during this period. You also have tremendous growth in cities like Chicago. Chicago, located on Lake Michigan, I think, was unprecedented. Chicago didn't even exist in 1830. I'm sorry, in 1800, but by 1830, Chicago had 30,000 people. By 1860, it had 90,000 people. The growth of Chicago tripled in a decade. Southerners had no desire for urban areas. They had no desire for cities. Of course, you had New Orleans, you had Charleston, you had San Antonio, you had Richmond. You did have cities in the South, but they were not the dynamic cities that you have in the North. Certainly nothing like Chicago, certainly nothing like the tremendous growth that you have in Chicago, which was a railroad center. You also have railroads in the South, but the railroad track in the North, it more than tripled the miles of railroad track in the North versus the South. But having talked about Northern industry, let me leave you on this note. The dominant industry of the North, or the dominant economy of the North by 1860, was still small farms. It was small family farms, not big corporate farms, but more importantly for our purposes, not the big cotton plantations that you see in the South. So even as the North is developing in terms of urbanization, even as you're starting to have industrialization in the North and it starts to take off, by 1860, the North is still a society of small family-owned farms, especially in the western areas of the North. It was considered the West at this time: Wisconsin, Western Ohio, Illinois, where Abraham Lincoln is from, Iowa, Michigan, Minnesota. These are still predominantly rural areas, but with family farms, not with the great plantations. When I say great, I mean large. They're not great, but they are large. You certainly don't have slavery, of course, in these farms as well. So they're family farms. There's still the sense of upward mobility, and it's very dynamic in that way. The last thing I'll say, I already said the last thing, but I usually do that. Even with all the industrialization of the North, in 1860, the value of human beings that were enslaved in 1860 was still worth more than all the industrial sector of the northern states. Let me say that again. The value of slaves in 1860 still was worth more than all the industrial sector, the manufacturers, the cotton mills, the woolen mills, the railroads in 1860. This shows you just how significant slavery was to the U.S. economy.